This week's Parsha is Parsha Mishpatim, which is the 18th Parsha, the 18th Torah portion, and it is the 6th Parsha in the book of Shemot. And in this week's Parsha, we are getting a lot of laws. In last week's Parsha, we received the 10 Commandments, and in this week's Parsha, we receive a lot of laws about interactions with people and damages, and it's really filled with laws, which sort of teaches us that, with the wonderful gift that Hashem gave us in last week's Parsha of the 10 Commandments, there is also a lot of responsibility that comes with that, and now it's sort of time for the Jews to take responsibility and to say, okay, in order to abide by these sort of commandments, in order to be God's people, we need this set of laws to regulate life. And also the people were living together now in the desert as the Jewish people, and they were going to encounter all sorts of situations that they needed to understand how to deal with them. And so that's sort of what we start to get in this week's Parsha. And something that I found fascinating as I was going through the Parsha is how many times we are given the example of an ox. And I think the reason we're given the example of the ox so often is because it was really something that most of the people had at the time. I don't know what the equivalent exactly now would be, maybe a dog or a cat or some sort of animal that everybody seems to have almost, but an ox is probably a very common object that everybody seemed to have, so it was given as an example. But I still really felt like there were lessons that we can gain from the instances where an ox is mentioned in this week's Parsha. So I thought I'd go through them and talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from Oxen. The first instance is what happens if you have an ox and your ox goes and gores a man or a woman and kills him or her. So if your ox is normally super tranquil, super calm, this is so out of the blue and random, then you kill the ox, but the owner doesn't suffer any additional punishments. Then you get to the situation of what happens if this animal is usually aggressive, and it's sort of like a habitual thing that it's been an aggressive animal, and maybe it's gored people before, or maybe it's hurt people and hasn't killed them. What happens if this is something that people warned the owner, saying your animal is aggressive and you need to watch out, and the owner doesn't listen? He said, oh no, my animal is a nice animal, I would never do that. And then your animal goes ahead and kills someone. Then not only is the ox put to death, but so is the owner, because the owner then is considered like a murderer because it allowed its ox its responsibility to go out and do something like that, to take someone's life. And so we can see already from that sort of first instance that there is great sort of responsibility we have to take for the actions of those that we are responsible for. We're really connected to them. We can't say, oh, it's not my problem, it has a mind of its own. We really are responsible for looking out for the actions of others, whether it be human or animal. Another instance where we see an ox in this week's Parsha is if you give your ox to someone to watch. If you are, let's say, going out of town and you leave your ox with your neighbor, and your ox dies while you're gone, then if the person who was watching your ox had nothing to do with it, no hand in the game, did what it was supposed to do, fed your animal when it was supposed to feed your animal, etc., then that person who was watching your ox is not responsible. They don't owe you anything. You should just accept the death, that this is when it was supposed to happen, and kind of unfortunate that you weren't there, but that is what it is. However, if, for example, your ox was stolen, if the person was negligent in looking after your animal that you asked them to watch, then they have to pay you a sum of money for being negligent. And so again, a lesson we can take here is that we need to take the objects of other people. We should think about the objects of other people and take responsibility for them, and don't sort of just stand by and let it be somebody else's problem. We have to be people who are constantly on the lookout and doing our job and taking our responsibility and taking things seriously. Somebody puts the life of their animal in your hands, do your job. Connecting the dots a little bit further, so now we just talked about the responsibility you have if somebody asks you to look out for their pet, for their ox, that you have to really take it seriously. But what happens if you find the ox of your enemy? What happens if you're wandering the streets, and I know it seems like a ridiculous example because we don't really have oxen now, but what happens if you're wandering the streets and you find the ox of of your enemy, what should you do then? Why should you do anything to help your enemy? Sure, you could you see the ox, and you could just let the ox continue on in its journey and pretend like you never saw it, and you wouldn't feel like you were helping your enemy. It would just continue. Why should you do anything to help them? But in the Torah specifically, it says that if you find the ox of your enemy wandering, you should return it to him repeatedly. Meaning that not just once. If you find this ox every single day, you should return it to that owner. Even if the owner is careless, even if you don't like the person, you should return it. That's how important it is. And it says, it goes further to say that if you find the ox or the donkey of your enemy and it is struggling under the weight of its burden, that you should obviously also again help it repeatedly. So I think there are a couple things we can gain from this also. One is that, again, it doesn't really matter whose stuff it is. When you find a lost object, you should do what you can to return it. You should do what you can to help someone, even if you don't like that person. Even if they're your enemy, you should continuously try to do your best to not stand idly by. You should try to do your best to help them in whatever situation it is. I think also what we can see from this is that things that bring us value, we can't take them too lightly, in the sense of, would it maybe cause financial harm, or would it maybe elevate the burden of our enemy if they don't have their ox? Yes, probably. And in that case, we shouldn't be inflicting those things even on our enemy. We don't wish those things for people. As Jews, we wish goodness for other people, even if we don't like them. We don't want to see bad things happening to them. We don't want to see their lives be more difficult, or we don't want to see them suffer. We want to do what we can to help them even when we don't like them. And I think that's like a huge lesson and something that all of us could work on. I hope all of you can take some lesson from the oxen, that we can learn something from them about lost objects, or the values of returning lost items, being responsible for things people have left us in charge of. And I hope you all have a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom.